All right, so let's dive into 1 Peter 5:7, and we're talking to you pastors and Bible study leaders, the folks who know this verse like the back of their hand, but are looking for something a little bit new.
Yeah, you've got sermons and lessons to plan. You need more than just the usual give your worries to God.
Exactly. We went deep on pastors.ai, and there are some pastors getting really creative with this verse.
It's really interesting how many of them are going beyond that passive idea of just handing your anxieties over.
Right, instead of just saying let go and let God, they're offering concrete steps for people to actually do that.
One sermon I thought was really interesting used the analogy of a car's check engine light. Instead of ignoring it or feeling guilty about it, you actually take it in and get it looked at.
So anxiety becomes a signal to pray, a signal to seek God's guidance.
Yeah.
I can see that one really resonating.
Absolutely. It reframes anxiety as a catalyst for spiritual growth, not a personal failing.
There was another pastor who had their congregation write their worries on sticky notes and then throw them away.
Imagine that visual, literally tossing your anxieties aside.
It's not just about intellectually understanding the verse, but creating a tangible experience of letting go.
And speaking of tangible experiences, several of the sermons focused on Jesus' leadership style, specifically that phrase, his yoke is easy.
Yes.
Oh.
But they weren't just talking about the shared burden aspect.
Right. One pastor I saw went deep on the Greek word for easy, which can also mean good or kind.
So it's not just about the weight of the yoke, but the nature of the one who's carrying it with you.
Absolutely. It really changes things. It paints this picture of Jesus' leadership as gentle, compassionate, and understanding, not harsh or demanding.
And that's such an important message, especially for people who are already carrying a lot of anxiety and feel overwhelmed.
Now, another theme that kept coming up was this idea of divine silence, which can be a hard one to preach on.
Divine silence. That's a tough one. How do you present that in a way that brings comfort rather than adding to people's anxiety?
Well, a lot of pastors approached it by comparing it to Jesus' experience in Gethsemane. He felt abandoned alone, yet he still turned to God in prayer.
So even when we don't feel God's presence, even when we're crying out and don't hear an answer right away, that doesn't mean it's not there.
Exactly. And that silence can actually be a chance to strengthen our faith.
It's a challenging message, but I think a necessary one.
Now, one obstacle to casting our anxieties that I saw in a lot of these sermons was buts.
The buts.
Yeah.
The fears and doubts that block us from experiencing God's promises.
One pastor used a really great analogy. I think it would be great for a youth group.
I'm intrigued. What was it?
Okay, so picture this. He talked about a child who's afraid of a spider. And that fear is so huge that they can't even see the beautiful park they're in. The sunshine, the other kids laughing, but the fear overshadows everything.
I love that. That's a really great visual. It makes the point so clear that fear can blind us to the blessings.
And how often do we do that as adults? Our worries and anxieties become that spider?
So how do we move past those buts? How do we help ourselves and others shrink that spider down? A lot of sermons focused on the community aspect.
Absolutely. Casting our anxieties, it's not just an individual thing. It's about leaning on each other, sharing those burdens so no one has to carry them alone.
It's like a burden shared is a burden halved, or in this case, a burden divided by the entire congregation.
And the church should be that safe space where people can come and just lay down their anxieties.
Yeah, it makes me think about how we can be more intentional about creating that supportive environment. Not just assuming it's there, but really fostering that culture of openness.
And a big part of that is encouraging humility.
Ah, yes. Putting our anxieties on God is an act of humility.
Yeah.
Recognizing we can't do it all ourselves.
One pastor used a great image talking about changing out of dirty clothes, exchanging those heavy burdens for God's clean peace.
It's a beautiful image.
Ah.
And a reminder that we don't have to carry those burdens alone. We can give them to God.
It's powerful, isn't it? That exchange of anxieties for peace.
It really is. I'm curious. You mentioned something earlier about a historical deep dive. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. One pastor did a fascinating deep dive into the historical context of the olive press in Gethsemane, talking about the crushing weight that was used to extract oil from the olives.
I never thought about it like that.
It's this powerful way to really connect with the pressure Jesus must have felt in that garden, facing the weight of the world's sin. And then he tied that back to 1 Peter 5:7, how we can bring our anxieties to God and allow him to bear that weight.
So it's not just about handing over our worries, but understanding the magnitude of what God is willing to take on for us.
Exactly. And that historical context, it adds such a visceral layer to the message.
You mentioned another sermon that used a sports analogy.
Yes, this one used the story of Eric Liddell, the Olympic runner who chose not to compete on a Sunday.
Oh, wow. I remember that story from the movie Chariots of Fire.
Right, and the pastor used that to illustrate how casting our anxieties on God, it's really an act of humility and trust in his plan.
It's about recognizing that we don't have to be in control. We can surrender our worries to a higher power.
Exactly. And by using a story like Eric Liddell's, it makes it relatable, even for people who might not be familiar with the Bible.
It's taking these abstract theological ideas and grounding them in real life.
And it shows how you can draw inspiration from all sorts of sources when you're preparing your sermons.
You don't have to limit yourself to just commentaries or devotional books. There are stories and insights everywhere if you know where to look.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from all of this. 1 Peter 5:7. It might seem familiar, but there's so much depth to explore.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface.
And that's what's so exciting. There's always more to learn and discover.
I was really struck by how many of these sermons emphasize the practical side of casting anxieties. How it's not just a one-time action, but an ongoing process.
Oh, absolutely. One pastor even called it a daily discipline, like exercise or meditation.
Conscious.
They talked about creating this ritual of writing down your worries and then physically handing them over to God in prayer.
That's a great idea.
It creates a tangible action. It reinforces that letting go.
And it helps to make surrender a habit.
Exactly. Another pastor talked about recognizing those triggers, the things that set off anxieties.
So instead of just reacting to our anxieties when they come up, we can be proactive about figuring out what causes them.
Right. Whether it's certain people or places, becoming aware of your triggers can help you to either avoid them or learn how to deal with them better.
It's about taking ownership of our mental and emotional well-being.
And that can be so empowering for people who feel trapped by their anxieties. You have a choice in how you respond.
And a big part of that choice is choosing to trust God.
Absolutely. It's recognizing that you're not in this alone. You have a God who loves you and cares for you.
It's about surrendering our anxieties to Him and allowing Him to work in our lives.
Beautifully said. This whole conversation, it's got me thinking about a question I want to ask our listeners. What if casting anxieties isn't just a one-time thing, but like a continual practice?
Yeah.
Choosing to trust and surrender over and over.
It's like we're not just emptying out a bucket, but constantly letting go of those little worries as they pop up.
Yeah. It's a shifting perspective from a one-time fix to a way of life.
And that's something I think so many people need to hear. We live in a world that's just full of reasons to be anxious.
Oh, it's true. Everywhere you look, there's a new thing to worry about. But this verse, 1 Peter 5:7, it offers us this antidote, this invitation to just let go and let God handle it.
Making that choice again and again, to trust in His goodness, His provision, His love.
You know what's amazing? The more we practice that surrender, the easier it gets.
It's like a muscle, right? The more we use it, the stronger it becomes.
Exactly. And that's what I really hope people take away from this. The idea that casting our anxieties on God, it's not just a nice thought. It's a practice that can change our lives.
It's about finding that peace that passes all understanding, that freedom from the weight of worry.
And it's about discovering that joy that comes from knowing we're not in control, but we are held in the loving hands of a God who is.
So to all the pastors and Bible study leaders out there, keep digging into this verse. Keep finding new ways to share its message.
Because 1 Peter 5:7, it's not just a verse. It's a lifeline, a source of comfort and hope that I think our world really needs.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, may you find peace in surrendering your anxieties to the one who cares for you most.